Ladies and gentlemen, we have a bit of time this afternoon before closing remarks, so I'd like to now open the floor to any questions. While you're all thinking, I'll kick off. We've heard over a number of the sessions this morning that Australia doesn't have the capacity to implement a comprehensive protections for maritime trade on its own, that we will have to rely on our allies and some of our regional partners. So I would like to open to the speakers from this afternoon to provide your views about how can Australia leverage off the policies of our allies and partners to ensure that we have an agile and flexible program that we can implement within what we know is a very dynamic security environment. The microphone is there on the...
And it works. Hold it close. There we go. Yes, here we are. Let's start with an easy question. Look, I think my first blush sort of response to that is perhaps a recognition that just as with domestic policing, you don't have to have absolutely comprehensive coverage in order to achieve the effect that you might be seeking. So I suppose the question comes down to in a sense, it's a risk management and a signalling process, and are the risk management settings and the signalling mechanisms that we've got in place fit for purpose, given the challenges that we are facing. And so we've had to adjust that, for example, in the last couple of decades to deal with the issue of piracy in the Indian Ocean, where we didn't expect we would have to put hundreds of vessels into the counter-piracy to try and address the counter-piracy problem. But we needed to, in a sense, change the risk dynamic for the pirates with, in a sense, a sufficient application of capability to achieve that effect. So it's just calibrating that correctly. So when we look at other domains, I think similar dimensions apply, and it's that in a sense of how you adjust your the signalling in the context of alliance frameworks is really about what collective response you can demonstrate and what will be seen as credible in terms of dealing with a particular problem at hand. So in terms of how we do that with allies, you just look at the example of the South China Sea, where there are a range of things that are undertaken unilaterally, but there are also a range of things that are undertaken with groups of nations acting in concert, which seek to demonstrate a willingness to protect our rights under international law. So whether that's sufficient is I think a question others might be better placed to answer, but I think that provides us with a reasonable example of the sorts of adjustments to that calibration of response to risk and messaging that we need to undertake when we're confronted with a new and an unusual problem.
I agree with what you've said. I suppose my focus would be more on how can Australia leverage the policy of a country like China that's not necessarily an ally nor a partner, and I think there are ways to do that. Alongside, the fact that China, of course, is not always a constructive partner for engagement. But having said that, I think what we're seeing, the commercialization of the South China Sea, for example, or China's attempt to engage in economic statecraft, I think these are policy directions that Australia can also benefit from and can also use to its advantage, given the fact that as a result, there are more stringent, I would say, stringent legal requirements that are put in place once you get kind of civilian infrastructure being built on the island, cruise ships going to these islands. So there are ways in which international regulations can come into play, and that may well be a kind of an indirect way to hold China more accountable for activities in the region. But on top of that, I think Australia, in light of the Pacific Step Up strategy, that also demonstrates how Australia can potentially, I wouldn't say learn per se, but also respond to what China's been doing in the region in a way that's very constructive, that speaks to the needs, the core needs of Pacific Island nations, and also to that key question of resilience. Because once you start building resilience for your partners, for your allies, that invariably comes back to you as well and helps enhance that sense of comprehensive security. So I think the focus should be not only on leveraging what Australia's allies and partners are doing, but equally on what Australia's not so much allies and partners are doing as well.
Yeah, thanks, Allison, for the question. I think if I get back to a couple of things, first of all, national resilience. What is it that we want to have that is sovereign? What are we happy that maybe we don't have to have that resilience with? And I can see the government is having that conversation. I mean, we can look at things such as 5G and the like. I mean, Australia has taken some quite challenging and steps forward in terms of resilience. Second thing I'd say is with the the competition that we're seeing in the world, it's actually opening up opportunity as well. And for a middle power, if I use that term for Australia, I mean, it brings to the fore, I think, opportunities. Foreign Affairs and Trade regularly talk about minilaterals, those non-established sort of partnerships that we have for a situation or a case. And I think those opportunities for Australia to take a lead in enabling that conversation in many things such as this is probably there, and the circumstances are there for us to take forward. The third thing I'd say is that we need to sit down with our partners and allies, and one that I'll pick on is our US alliance, because as a defence element, it's still very critical. But we need to have a more quite deliberate conversation about it and almost reshape some of those partnerships and alliances for the future challenges that we have, and get down to some of the brass tacks about some quite in-depth conversation about where we are going to leverage on our own and where we will need to get them to assist us in leveraging in the future.
I think, Allison, you're spot on in that the only way this can be done is through alliances and partnerships. And to take Sonter's last point there, we need to remember that the price of alliance is entanglement. And when it comes to maritime operations, entanglement is a much more evident risk than it is in necessarily land or other concepts, because at sea, representatives of sovereignty intermix and entangle with each other every day because they're ships. And so when you're doing merchant vessel protection, the chances of that entanglement are just escalated more than almost any other maritime operation I can think of, because you're then dealing with the moment you come to the moment you're in a multinational operation that's protecting merchant vessels, the moment you come to the defence of that merchant vessel, which might be flagged in some other state at the request of another state, but it's some other state that's actually used force, you're entangling yourself in that right now. It's no longer just a matter between the US and the flag state in Iran. I'm being, hypothetical here. It's now a matter between the US, the flag state, Iran, and us. We are now implicated in that. So we just need to be, that doesn't mean we should walk away from it. Absolutely not. This is too critical. The bigger picture here is trade and economic survival. No way we should walk away from it. But we should walk into it eyes wide open that the cost in these operations is entanglement, and we can't avoid that.
Thank you. Any questions?
Warwick Pitt, third-year trainee. For Professor McLaughlin, sir, just want to ask, how does passage intersect with trade merchant escort in the legal context?
So it's a good question, because the nature of these straits is as territorial sea. We didn't used to have this argument. Before the Law of the Sea Convention, we didn't have this argument. Why? Because the territorial sea was generally around 3 to 6 nautical miles. So most of those straits that we're now talking about as critical straits actually had high seas passages through the middle, and that was just high seas freedoms. The moment the territorial sea was settled, it expanded out to 12 nautical miles, many of these straits, hundreds, were shut off from having a high seas passage. So they now have they're now, in their underpinning nature, there is territorial sea. But because the package deal of the Law of the Sea Convention was, well, if we're going to do that, then you need to give us something that equates to high seas passage through the middle, which is straits passage through, transit passage through a strait used for international navigation. That is normal mode. So we can do more than just innocent passage. And it is non-suspendable, and it shouldn't be hampered. So we need to maintain that because some states, including Iran, have objections to the straits transit regime. And so they may act as if it is territorial sea and we are required to exercise innocent passage. Wrong. We need to hold to our point of view, which is that it's a strait used for international navigation. We have normal mode, and that includes the ability to escort and protect merchant vessels, accepting that if it was innocent passage, we wouldn't have that right. So it's really important to be very, very clear about how we structure what we call the area that we're going to operate in.
Up the back.
Excuse me, Doug Stevens. There have been some really disturbing pockets of information come out of today. From my perspective, we've heard from 15 very well-informed stovepipes within our governing infrastructure, I'll call it that. And the theme of she'll be right, mate, and market forces will sort it out. And not only market forces, by extension, defence is expected to sort out what, based on what we've heard and our lead time in being able to react. And what we've heard is that essentially we are a reactive country. Each of the 15 stovepipes that we've heard from, essentially, I think, have painted a picture where we're well informed, we know what's going on, we've got almost zero fuel stocks. That, by extension, to just about every other area of this whole scenario, strategic but becoming tactical, we are only going to be able to react, and we're going to have to react from the bottom of a cliff because the lead times are such that that's what it'll take. There seems to be a need for an overriding or overarching organisation or a viewpoint to assimilate, aggregate these 15 different stovepipes of information and come up with a plan, dare I say it. I'd like to ask the panel, who might execute that role, that oversight role? I mean, simple answer is, well, that's the government, but perhaps there's somebody in between.
It's an excellent question, which Sonter will answer.
Who will own it? I think I don't have an answer for that, but if I could maybe give an exemplar of who is owning it and what we're learning. And I don't disagree with some of your comments. I mean, we are learning probably beyond when the action has come forward. But sometimes, as I said in my outline before, we've taken some quite positive actions as a consequence. And as a country, some that are world leading. And let me give you an exemplar of the Pacific Step Up as an exemplar where we've maybe learned not only in terms of coming potentially late to the party, but also reforming ourselves so that when we deliver those effects, which we are now, they're delivered in a synchronised aspect. And that is through the Office of the Pacific, where we have a person who has been charged by the National Security Cabinet. He has the delegations and the authorities to actually run out across the departments all of those requirements to effectively enable a greater resilience in the Pacific Island nations. And that office is actually coordinating across governments, departments, and has a whole range of people from government departments, but also importantly, outside government departments as well. So, look, it's not your answer to your question, and you are right to in fact that we are maybe late in some, but there are some positives that are coming out of this growing strategic competition that we have here at the moment, and as I said, is only going to get worse.
And I defer to Rob.
There's a pattern emerging here. Look, I understand where you're coming from, and I sympathise significantly with what you've said. I do think, though, as the Commodore mentioned, we have made some pretty important gains in this, and certainly I think it's true that our political leadership gets it. And the whole process that led to the Pacific Step Up also included a Southeast Asian strategic response as well. That hasn't been as widely sort of publicised. And I think that's those are key steps along a journey of, in a sense, reimagining our strategic environment and our strategic priorities. I think if you go back into sort of not too, the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, we really liked the peace dividend, and I think we've been holding on to that for as long as possible, because that world was one we liked. We liked this idea that yes, economic opportunity would prevail, bring us all together. That China's economic rise would be accompanied by a process of political liberalisation, and this would all be great for everybody. That Russia would get over its post Soviet collapse hump and turn into something that looked more like a Poland or a Hungary. But those things haven't happened, and we're now in a world where we've got in a sense, as far as we look at great powers, a peer competitor for the US in the shape of China, one that is pursuing a strategic agenda that is often in substantial ways inimical to our interests. Responding to that is not easy to do. And it's something the US is struggling with too. While I certainly think that they have made some great policy gains in terms of the suite of new policy documents that they've produced over the last 12 months, if you look then at how that's reflected in actual deployment of the resources that underpin sort of military superiority, there is some substantial gaps there in terms of how quickly that's adjusting in terms of the US defence budget. And I think for us, we're along a similar, we're all going through a similar sort of harsh realisation, harsh adaptation, and I think for us too, we've got to come to terms with, first of all, a sharper understanding of the policy implications. I think that a new defence white paper or even a national security strategy, were the government to embrace that. They sort of haven't so far been inclined to do something like that. But I think whatever the next big policy document will look like, it will be a much tougher-minded and I think more determined policy construct than we've seen so far. And if you just look at if you compare the signalling in the foreign policy white paper in 2017 to the defence white paper, which I agree was essentially a 2014 document, you see a significant shift in the sort of I suppose the bleakness of the strategic outlook presented there. And I think something that was to come now would be further along that path. But I do say that we've made lots of progress. One area we have yet to make real progress on is on the resourcing side. I really question whether 2% of GDP on defence, not that necessarily that's a great measure, but in terms of the number that produces, I think the reality is we need to have a conversation with the Australian people about just what sort of how much security do they want to buy, because the current trajectory in terms of defence spending that I can see is not going to be adequate.
Rob, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to. We've got one more question that we really need to get to, and we're out of time. So can I just go to that question there, and then we really need to go to our closing remarks. Sorry.
Good afternoon. My name's Peter Martin, University of Tasmania. this question is ultimately for Dr. Pichamon. We heard earlier this morning about the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, where the Portuguese and Spanish decided they need to divide each other as a fairly homogenous group of the same religion to make sure they didn't clash while they were doing their world adventures. 35 years later came the Treaty of Tordesillas when they finally made it around the other side of the world, which split the world at 142 degrees east. Could we entertain the notion that perhaps if we move that line 38 degrees east, we could have a Anglo-Saxon, Latin, Hispanic side of the world and an Asian side of the world?
I feel like that's a trick question. Is it possible just to end on that question? It's a discussion after this, but thank you for that. That's a very entertaining thought indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking our four presenters for the afternoon?